All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's LSA training for HMIS system administrators. My name is Maria Berg, and I'm in product marketing at Ecovia Solutions. Our presenter today is Dan Fox, our product manager, and Eric Wilka will be helping out, our HMIS product manager. And with that, let's get started.
Thank you, Maria. Well, thank you for everyone for attending. I'm just going to cover a couple quick objectives first. I'm not going to read these out to you, but we are going to start off with a little bit of overview and context. I know for some of you, or imagine many of you, you're neck deep in the NOFA process, and so we just wanted to frame the conversation a little bit and also give you as much information as possible to take back to your peers in your community. And then we're going to cover some differences between the old AHAR process and the new LSA process, and also we want to make sure we give you as much up-to-date, as soon as we're hearing information from HUD as possible. We realize that, HUD has not provided trainings yet on HDX and LSA submissions, so we want to make sure we're doing due diligence to keep you as in the loop as possible. And then we're going to cover some specific potential data issues and ways that you can have your users and folks in your community working toward a good LSA submission before the LSA even opens. So the LSA, again, we're just going to briefly cover some high-level context initially. It stands for the Longitudinal System Analysis, and HUD really is reinforcing this idea of longitudinal. We'll cover that more in a little bit. And it applies to, any HMIS implementations under HUD's continuum of care program that, includes the broader, context of continuum of care programs than, had historically been used. And it's going to be aggregate data that you are submitting to HUD through the HDX that HUD will be able to, assess nationwide. And the last points I'm sure you're very well aware of, but, even though LSA isn't technically a required report, it's essentially required. We all know it's required in the sense that it can certainly affect the COC's funding competitiveness. So we are, certainly taking this very seriously at Ecovia Solutions and want to make sure that we do everything we can to help you all have a good submission. Now, I specified here in the last part that it's part of the annual AHAR, and we're going to cover in this next slide a little bit what I mean specifically by that. And the reason this is important is because even internally, when you're using nomenclature, you're so used to talking about things an old way. We would call the fall submission the AHAR, HUD would call it the AHAR, you all would call it the AHAR, but HUD really is parsing out the broader AHAR, which is HUD's requirement to report to Congress from the different pieces that you all have to submit that contribute to the AHAR throughout the year. So the first part, the part you've already done so far this year is the annual point in time count and the housing inventory count. And the second part was what used to be called the AHAR in the fall. It's the old HMIS data that HUD collected 4 times based on 4 specific point-in-time counts through the year. It's submitted to HDX, do a lot of corrections, work with a data reviewer, all that. This second part, this part that's happening in the fall specifically that we're coming up on, HUD is renaming to the LSA, the Longitudinal System Analysis. They have a new system, HDX 2.0, that they'll be leveraging to collect this information. We'll also cover that in a little bit. A lot of what they wanted to do here was have the availability to collect data without so much manual data entry, because HUD is looking for a lot more data. In fact, they want to be able to generate approximately 700 tables from data you'll be submitting, up from the approximately 180 they have now. So clearly that's a huge lift, and so rather than placing that lift on your manual data entry prowess, they are specifying that all this data, needs to be generated through CSV, much like the system performance measures and the APRs, ESG CAPER, everything seems to be moving to the CSV process where HUD defines very specifically exactly how they wanted everything counted, and then you all will upload a CSV file. Another reason here is HUD really wants to remove ambiguity from this whole process. Both on the vendor side, they, have sample code they've provided, very, very detailed specifications. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to look at the novel that the LSA specifications are. But also on the community side, they want to remove, they want things defined how they want them defined, counted how they want them counted, and they want less. They want to standardize it across the country, so less interpretations at the local level. And they also want to worry less about changes in the future. What they hope to be able to do is collect data, again, longitudinally. And then 5 or 6 years down the road, should they decide they want to look back historically and slice and dice data a different way, they'll have all this aggregate data at their disposal. They won't have to go back to the vendors, cause a lot of changes to code, et cetera, have you all backfilled data. So again, just a little more context here. The LSA is, it's moving toward that system level that HUD really is prioritizing. It includes more project types than the old AHAR process used to. It's going to include data about returns to homelessness, and it is going to be longitudinal. And when HUD is referencing longitudinal, we've experienced some questions from you all, and also HUD has gotten quite a few AAQs from system administrators on their sysadmin calls. Even though the report is going to be run for the report period, so, coming up, that will be October 1st through September 30th, just like you all are used to. It is going to look back, much like the system performance measures do, in the sense that if data appears in a current reporting period, it could cause the report to look back at older data. And so they really are trying to see changes over time. I know when I worked with TA and when I worked in the community, it was always very frustrating that AHAR did not align with HMIS data standards. HUD's made a lot of effort to try to align that better. They're going to be asking for new data, new demographic information, different population groups, system use measures. And HUD wants to take under control themselves the generation of the reports. So this, I expect, might cause some consternation at first, and is not something that any of us are really used to, but HUD wants to have all the data exported up, the aggregate data exported up to HDX 2.0, and then they will define the reports that A, they want to see, and B, that they will provide back to you all. This last bullet point here, I want to make sure I stress, we already have seen some questions about this. HUD does not intend to allow communities to be able to manually enter or change data in the HDX 2.0. It's going to solely rely on this CSV upload process. So I mentioned the demographics. They're adding some demographics here. You all get a copy of this slide deck later, so we wanted to try to be as complete as possible so that you could reference it. I'm not going to take up a bunch of your time reading all these off, but there are additional added demographics. Some of the things that they, for instance, were collecting or adding to the AHAR reporting via census data, now they're going to try to get directly from HMIS data, such as disability status, and of course, chronic homelessness status is a big one. Also, geography type, I just want to call that one out. We have to cover that one in a bit more detail in further slides, but it's very important that geography information and also inventory information is going to be accurate. So this slide here, what we wanted to try to do is, even though the LSA works in a very complicated way, ultimately kind of coming out of the end result of this, HUD is really focusing on the household level data collection, and broadly speaking, the LSA will sum to these three household types. Household types that you should be used to, adults with children, adult-only households, and then child-only households. And within each of these households, there's a set of shared demographics that HUD wants to be able to look at. So these are all the shared demographics, disabled people, households with disabled persons in them, first-time homeless versus, returning homeless, quick returners, long stayers, and chronically homeless. And then for each category, HUD is going to be looking at some unique demographics. So whether it be unaccompanied youth or unaccompanied children or veteran, clearly veteran only applies to adults, so those are only collected for certain ones. They want to look hard at the parenting youth and the parenting children. And then they're also looking at some demographics for the, households with adults and children. They want to see if households that have 3 or more children are contributing to homelessness in a specific way. And then also some additional categories there for the adults only.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but we have some questions that kind of relate to what you're talking about.
Okay.
So Lynn asks, how does this affect our projects in HMIS that are privately funded?
How does it affect projects that are privately funded? So we will chat about this a little bit more, especially under inventory, but essentially the way HUD defines it's complicated, but essentially it could be potentially reported if a project is considered to be a COC project, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be HUD funded. It could mean that it's dedicated to serving homelessness in the COC. HUD has really clarified that over the last couple of years, and especially been looking at that more in the housing inventory count, making sure that they're getting a complete look at projects and inventory that are COC-wide regardless of funding, and the LSA follows the same logic. And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about how, in later slides, about how important the inventory is going to be and how HUD's really attempting to line up the LSA with the housing inventory count moving forward. Maybe a more specific way to say it is you probably should have been reporting them on your HIC, but if you didn't report them on the HIC, then you might want to look at that moving forward and making sure that they're aligned, because LSA looks at project types that are in the COC regardless of how they're funded. Again, so just a little more high-level information, LSA is really going to be looking at these specific system use measures in detail: length of time homeless, housing outcomes, specifically placement and retention of permanent housing, and also returns to homelessness, although it's going to be looking at them a bit differently than the system performance measures, which we'll cover some specific differences shortly. So overall, from what we understand about how HUD intends this process to work at the current time, and it feels like every few weeks information gets tweaked a little bit, so granted this information could potentially change, but what we know so far is that HUD intends each community to direct upload the LSA files to the HDX 2.0. There'll be one zipped folder with 10 files in it. And then from there, HDX 2.0 will do a lot of the analytic heavy lifting. And this is where they'll do a lot of calculations on the back end, provide hopefully some reports for local use, give you warnings, and do some system validations and provide some system cleaning tools. And one thing that I hope turns out to be really cool is that they intend to make HDX available year-round, as opposed to the old HDX, which was only open during a specific report period. And what they intend with this is, while yes, there will be a formal submission process every fall, they want to be able to provide the tools and leverage what they're building HDX 2.0 out to be in a year-round way. So you could hopefully, submit, your LSA files to the HDX multiple times per year if you want to, maybe do data quality checks or see how, things are looking. They want to provide some system modeling tools, tie things into system performance measures. So while we don't know a lot of information yet about exactly how they are planning to do this, and we do know that they're actively working in tweaks to HDX 2.0 right now as we continue to test our files, it is kind of a cool idea that they'll allow you to use this year-round without being under the pressure of, having HUD look at that data year-round or submit. So there will be a difference between uploading your files for, personal use for your community versus an official submission. So of course, then they're going to use the data to report to Congress, but then they also want to provide some dynamic local reports, analyses for specific populations, and then feed into these other tools that at the moment sound like they will be outside of HDX. So these next two slides here, really the point of these two slides, if there's nothing else you take away from these two slides, it's that do not expect to be able to compare your system performance measures to the LSA. I think, and this includes myself, I think we all probably assumed that there was going to be a certain type of alignment between them and things defined or counted in similar ways. HUD is taking the opportunity with the LSA to look at information differently, and they are stressing if you run your system performance measures and try to compare to the LSA, you're going to come up feeling very empty and probably frustrated. So we've listed out some of the high-level general differences here on this slide between the LSA and the system performance measures. And on the next slide, we're going to look at some specific differences in measures, system performance measures. So the LSA really, while it does look at individual client data to make all its calculations, the LSA as a whole is really looking to the head of household to be the determining factor for that household, and it's really classifying everything at the household level. Another difference is that the LSA is looking at permanent housing project types in a more fine way than the system performance measures are. So they're breaking them out into the individual project types. They're providing detailed breakdowns for many more categories, providing detailed breakdowns across the board where system performance measures really aren't providing those breakdowns. And again, if you remember, the L in LSA stands for longitudinal. They really are looking at distributions of time as opposed to points in time, or as system performance measures defines them, medians of time. So looking at things over distributions of time really can make understanding the LSA very complicated because it really highly depends on the data. You tweak one little thing in the data, the LSA code might count a distribution of time very differently. So these are the measures you're probably very used to talking about at this point, especially with the introduction of the system performance measures. And again, we're really trying to reiterate here, don't trouble yourself to try to compare the two. These are all calculated differently in the LSA than the system performance measures. The LSA specifications, if you're really curious for a deeper dive into the differences, HUD does actually attempt to articulate them in Appendix D of the LSA specifications. But again, some of the differences are, because the LSA is focusing on households as opposed to people. When they were focused on returns to homelessness, for instance, they're focusing on returns to homeless of the same household configurations instead of individual returns to homelessness. And as I'm sure you can imagine, that would change drastically the way that returns to homelessness are calculated. And it's not that system performance measures is right and LSA is wrong or vice versa. It's that HUD is intentionally trying to look at data in a different way with the LSA than what they already are through system performance measures. Another example, and I'm just going to give a couple examples here to highlight this point. I'm not going to dwell on this, but in the LSA, any 2 dates of homelessness are considered continuous as long as they are separated by less than 7 days, so that break. But in system performance measures, a gap of a single day is treated as a break. So that means that the LSA might cascade back a lot further than system performance measures when it's looking at old longitudinal data. Maria, I'm going to take a brief pause there, make sure I pause and see if there's any questions so far.
Okay. I know Daniel Ramos had some questions about Data Explorer, and specifically he was asking the LSA returns, or is it using case ID or family account ID?
The particular answer to that one would be neither.
And this is part of the challenge, and we are certainly, I'll mention this later, so we have some ideas for how individual projects could troubleshoot data quality in the meantime. And we are working on some potential tools for you to use as system administrators for a more system-wide look, but it is very important to underscore that LSA is unlike anything we've ever seen, and it is truly unique in the way it's calculating things. So, yeah. I mean, again, it's not necessarily bad or good, but I imagine that it will take us all an adjustment period to get used to thinking about LSA in the new way it's looking at things.
And then Joan asked a question, how does LSA handle unknown household type? An example, when some household members don't have birthdays, so that household type can't be determined.
They'll be counted as unknown household. So there are, so again, we'll cover a lot more of this in the technical training that will be following, but they will be counted as unknown household type, as long under certain other conditions they weren't served under another known household type, would be the short answer.
All right. So some of this information is a combination between what we're hearing from the vendor calls and also for those of you that were able to attend the system administrator call last week, HUD announced some of this. And so, but we just want to make sure all of you are updated with what we're hearing so far about the process. And HUD is moving the timeline back. There are some tweaks they're making for the vendors for the LSA, as well as adding, it sounds like they're planning on adding some additional information to the LSA with some potentially new code. We already know that they made a change to zip codes that we're working on implementing as we speak. But HUD recognizes that it's a bit, 11th hour, and they're also, I think, wrestling with the idea of, do we want to put communities in a position where things are, slowly and iteratively tweaked over the next few years, or do we want to try to kind of rip the Band-Aid off and make changes that we know about now? And it sounds like they're choosing the latter, which even though it might sound worse, I think is actually probably a good thing long-term for all of us. But the benefit here is that because they're moving the timeline back by about, well, so far they say at least 2 weeks. We hope to know more on the 6th. HUD plans or they've said they've planned on engaging the vendors about this timeline. We haven't heard any more about it yet. But the benefit to you all is that HUD also will commensurately move the submission deadline to match. From HUD's perspective, if they implement this new process well and they're able to use the HDX 2.0 to do more of the heavy lifting behind the data analysis, they should still be able to easily meet their deadline with Congress without, having to have so much manual data review in the months leading up to that report. What we heard last week was that they plan on a kind of a multi-stage submission process rather than the old way where you submit in kind of a first-in, first-out fashion some sample data and then you tweak it and then do a final submission. It sounds like they're, at least for this year, planning on kind of a 4-stage process, and they're using terminology like upload attempt and upload success. So it sounds like once they open the HDX 2.0 for you all to use, there will be an upload attempt deadline, which is kind of a beta test. Communities, run their files, get used to HDX. I hope that they're going to provide some training to you all on how to use HDX, and then they'll follow that up with some kind of upload success deadline. So the distinction here is you have a little while to test your run, and let's say, for instance, maybe you get some validation errors. You get a chance to go back and troubleshoot that, figure out what's happening, and then have a deadline by which there'll be some kind of successful upload defined. And then HUD actually plans on taking a break, looking at what they're seeing across the country as far as submissions and where communities seem to be struggling, and actually take some time to address potential needed code changes or clarify the spec with all of the vendors, and then start the actual submission process, which will include the kind of standard review steps, and if Apt Associates needs to have you resubmit anything, that'll happen then. And then much later, some kind of confirmation deadline. So it sounds like they're going to give lots of time for the actual testing of your LSA submission once the HDX 2.0 is open. So it won't be like a mad dash for you to have everything perfect right away. We wanted to give you some information here about how to prepare. I know that we did release an announcement, I guess a few weeks ago at this point, with some suggestions and covering some high-level information about the LSA. We cannot stress this first one enough. Make sure all of your COC projects are in HMIS. And again, this does not necessarily mean COC-funded projects. It's based on the HUD definition of what qualifies as a COC project. And it's also regardless of whether or not they're participating. This also means that DV project that maybe you haven't historically recorded their project descriptor information in HMIS, those need to also be submitted. Now, the caveat with DV projects is, of course, you're not required to list an address for obvious reasons, but you really, really need to make sure all of your projects are recorded in HMIS, even if they're not recording client data in HMIS. And we'll get a little bit more into that in a minute here. But remember, the definition is all continuum projects within a COC's jurisdiction, regardless of whether the project participates in HMIS, are required to have a project record in the HMIS. And HUD is going to be using the LSA and comparing against the HIC to ensure this is happening. So HUD is taking this more seriously than they ever have. And commensurately, the project descriptor data elements, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive on the following slides here about a couple in particular to look out for, but make sure that those are accurate. And then, of course, you know, as you should be all year round, data quality, data quality, data quality. So the first really pivotal piece of information for your LSA working properly is going to be the geography information for each of your projects. I'm just including a screenshot here to remind you all how to get that. Once you pull up the program you're looking for, the project you're looking for, open up the menu, click on project geocodes and addresses. And this is where you'll need to add your address information. So if you don't have anything in here, you'll click Add New, and this information that I have circled here is all very important. So the information date, the COC code, geocode, address, again, unless it's a DV project, and the zip code is particularly relevant. And the reason the zip code is relevant, you all may have seen in the announcement that HUD was going to be classifying things in specific geography types. This is something we added as a read-only option to the form that you all will get. And it's not something that you all will enter yourself. It's something that HUD has a list of, thousands and thousands of zip codes and exactly how they want them classified, whether it be urban, suburban, or rural. And this information is going to be cross-referenced in the LSA. But if you don't have your zip code completed, that information, you'll get errors in the LSA. The second bit of information here that's critical is your inventory records. So again, back on your program screen, go to bed and unit inventory information. And here you might have multiple inventory records. And I'll cover how HUD's released some updated guidance about how they want this information collected that we're going to dive into in a second here. But you want to make sure that each of your projects, that have inventory record collected on this screen. And this inventory, HUD intends, again, to cross-reference with housing inventory. I imagine this first year, they expect some challenges, but they're going to be certainly cross-referencing this a lot more. What I want to specifically mention here, there seems to be a lot of confusion around the dates and how HUD wants them used. And HUD actually even addressed this in a vendor call specifically, so we're going to dive into that a little bit. But I want to make sure that you all are aware this inventory information date here is probably the most critical date to get right for your LSA. So I wanted to make sure you all had this information. I'm not going to read through it because I think it'll become much more relevant to you on the next slides when you see the examples. But there's essentially 5 date fields. 2 of them are system generated and hidden. They're required by HUD to be system generated. And then there's 3 dates, that your users have control over. The inventory start date, the information field, and then the the inventory end date. Now, the inventory start date and end date, I imagine are a little more obvious. It really be, the inventory start date's when it became available. Inventory end date is when the information's either closed. I'll pull up the next slide here. When the inventory record is closed out, if the inventory is still active, that end date would be blank. Now, where it gets a little nebulous is in the middle there, and how the inventory end date could interact with the information date. And as I said, this information date is the most important for LSA, and HUD really means for this information date to be the date that tells reporting the date that this inventory record is accurate. So it's not necessarily when it became available, although it could be the same date as it became available, depending on any changes that were made. But if it's under development, then that means your information date would probably be in the future, and would be the date that it would come online. If it's an existing inventory, it would be the effective date of any change that doesn't require a new inventory record. I'm going to cover a couple examples here to highlight this, because the first time I heard about this, it was a little head scratching, and we had a lot of questions for HUD too. So I'm just going to dive right into some examples here. So in this first example, so let's pretend I have to go into HMIS and create a new inventory record, and in this particular case, I know that the project's receiving funding. I know that we're going to go online on October 1st. So I'm going to get in there nice and early. For some reason, I'm really feeling up on my data collection, and I go in there as soon as I know about this, all the way back in March, and I create this record. So these two gray columns here are columns that are just automatically system generated based on HUD requirements. So in this particular case, the date created date is simply the date that I created the record. It has no relevance to the reporting. Now, because this inventory is going to come online in October, I enter that that's the date that the inventory is going to start. Now, in this particular case, the information date is going to be the same as the start date, because the information date signifies that as of October 1st, this record will be accurate. And some of the reasons for HUD splitting it out that way is because for certain things like the housing inventory count, if you're a community that pulled from HMIS, HUD wants to be able to potentially determine the difference between when information was started, or when inventory record might be new versus when there might have been any changes. Now in this case, they're both the same start date, same as the information date. I have no end date here because this is my current record. So I have 10 beds, 1 unit. I'm just keeping the numbers simple for an example. Now, let's say that, in December, that project that I entered a record for loses 5 beds. Now, the important thing to remember here is you should not delete that old inventory record. That old inventory record is still important to have in your system. Now, the date updated, you'll notice that the system automatically recorded that I needed to that I made a change to this record because I had to enter an inventory end date. So when I click save on this inventory end date, this date's automatically updated. These gray columns are system dates. I just included them to be complete, and because HUD has included them on some training, I didn't want anyone to get confused. But the important thing here is that I needed to end this record because my bed count changed. And this is what I found initially to be a challenging part. Since these 5 beds are part of the original record, I keep the same inventory start date. These 5 beds that it still exists, came online back on October 1st of 2017. However, this new information date means that this information is accurate as of this December 10th date. So this original record, this information was accurate as of 10/1. This was accurate as of 12/10. Now, the thing here that HUD wants us to remember is this inventory end date. Because I needed to change the record, this inventory end date should be dated the day before the new information date in order for reports to work right. So as of right now, this second row is my current inventory. Now, let's say that we added some more beds and we got some more funding. The original beds are still there, but we added 2 additional units for a total of 10 beds. So I'm not going to close out this old inventory record because these beds still exist. I need to add a new one. So this information start date and information date, again, are going to be the same because that's when the new beds came online. And this end date, clearly, because this is also active at the same time, is going to be a null value at the moment. So if I were looking at this, as of, the end of, the 29th or after, I would actually see that I have 15 beds with 3 units. But recording the dates like this allows HUD to write specs that could potentially look back at older dates to see what the inventory looked like at the time. So the most important thing to remember is this information date signifies the date that that information is accurate. So if I looked at New information. I have 15 beds, 3 units. These beds would not be duplicated even though they are the same start date because the information date is different. Now, if I look back, from the date I created this record to the information date, the report would see that I had 10 beds under development. And then if it looked after this date, it would see that they're current. So I imagine we're going to have questions about that. It's kind of complicated to explain. I hope I didn't butcher it for you all, but please at the end let us know if you have questions about that. At the moment here, I'm going to turn this over to Eric. He's going to talk about some potential significant data impacts here that your data may have on the LSA.
Yeah, so it's like some getting used to. So some areas of data quality we wanted to point out that will have a significant data impact. To be clear, these won't necessarily be flagged as something as a data quality error. So just to take the point of the first one, we know that it's an error if someone has a client location of null. If there's no client location for the enrollment, we know that is a data quality error. But if an enrollment serves 2 or 3 different COCs, and let's say they're only marked for one, or they're marked in one, but they really should have been marked for a different one, there's no way of really telling that from a report standpoint what to correct. Mostly we just wanted to point out that client location will have a significant impact because the LSA will only consider enrollments that are located in the report COC. And when we say report COC, we mean that when you're running your LSA, you identify that this LSA export is for this particular COC. So if you're using this for a balance of state, you'll have to point out that you'll have to run it for that particular balance of state COC. And only clients with enrollments located in that COC will be considered. And that goes for looking at active enrollments or for activity active in the report range, as well as when you're looking at previous data. So in general, with just about every report, making sure you have accurate entry-exit dates, your bed nights are correct, and your move-in dates are also correct. This will be especially important because the LSA will be looking for chronic homeless time, system use, days that they're housed, and it'll be based off of the dates you have entered in HMIS. So if you have a lingering open enrollment for someone in an emergency shelter or another project, all that time will be accumulating in the LSA. Last two relation to head of household and date of birth. Those are going to have very significant because what counts as a unique LSA household is partially determined by who is the head of that household. And if you have 0 or more than 1, the LSA does have logic to determine who the client ID is going to be designated as the head of household. So you always want to make sure that's correct. And especially if you have maybe the same family account came in multiple times and each time there's a different head of household. If that is accurate, then absolutely that should be left accurate. If that needs to be cleaned up, that'll be something you'd want to address. Similarly with date of birth, if you're looking at what is a unique LSA household, it's going to be based off of who's the head of household and then also what's the household type. So if you have people that are missing dates of birth, that could potentially impact a count of returns or how many households are being counted in your LSA. After that, you want to also make sure that your 3.917 data is as accurate as it can be. So living situation, length of stay, approximate homeless start date, the times that they've been homeless in the last 3 years, and how many months is that added up to. All those you want to make sure as accurate as possible. From a setup data perspective, you want to make sure that you're doing your audits of your setup data, so making sure that people are identified as a continuing project, yes or no. If you have projects that are mistyped, you would definitely want to make sure that is correct, as well as the standards for tracking for emergency shelters, because again, just switching from a night-by-night to entry-exit can have a very big impact on your data. So all of those things will be taken into account in the LSA, and it'll all be based off of what you have in your setup data. Because of the logic, we want to make sure that your compliance crosswalks are set. And these haven't changed since 10.117. So if you've done your SSVF uploads or your RI uploads, that would have given you a chance to kind of test that these are set in your system. But in general, just as a reminder, relationship of household, gender, prior living, and exits, those are ones you want to make sure you have mapped. For the reports, we're looking at the data element for exit destination. This is a very similar slide that they published on the system administrator call, and so we've just updated it with our own information. So in general, the HUD data quality report, the validations from the CSV CAPR or CSV APR, as well as the active client list are going to be some very helpful reports in seeing if and identifying if there's any data that potentially needs to be corrected. And again, just listing the specific ones here. One thing
I do want to jump in for a second here, Eric, and just highlight that these tools could be useful for projects to run their data quality level. As far as the LSA system data quality, in the technical training that we have following up, we'll talk about tools that we intend to provide for system administrators, but these hopefully can be helpful for individual project level staff to troubleshoot their own data.
Good point. Yeah, if you're looking for what can individual projects do to help clean up data quality, this would be a great reference for them. So when we're looking at data quality from kind of a system level, there are going to be some quirks between the existing reports and the LSA. So for example, in one of the main report files, LSA report, there are a series of data quality questions, and because of how the LSA is supposed to work and how the system performance measures are supposed to work, just because you would have some enrollment data that is not coming as an error on the system performance measures, it might come up as having a data quality problem on the LSA. And again, that's just because of how the two reports are supposed to work differently. But kind of a caveat to that is, just because you have a single enrollment for a client that has some missing data or some poor data, that doesn't mean necessarily on your, in like your LSA household or person or exit or anything like that, that they will be counted as having an error, or that, that particular person wouldn't have any data for any of the questions there. And also, as we're waiting to hear back on some changes from HUD, just to let you know that in the current version, some of the data quality things, there's no type of check for funding source or for necessarily that the applicable clients are the same between what's in the data quality and what's expected to be in the LSA report files. So for example, most of the demographics are really more for adults and active household. The data quality counts it as is looking at all clients. And then similarly, there are some questions about domestic violence, and so SSVF is not required to collect that. So in the current version, there's no distinction between funding sources that are required to collect or not collect. That also go along the same lines with non-funded entities. So currently as it's written, so again, we are still waiting for updates, but we're not sure how HUD will want to take that into consideration. If the data quality essentially looks if it's there or if it's not there. So this is mostly to say that you may see some things that come up in a report that wouldn't necessarily be come up in your workflow as required. So we're still waiting to hear back from HUD on some of those, but also to point out that just because you have a problem in your data doesn't necessarily mean that that enrollment should be excluded, the project is wrong, or that there's any particular threshold or cutoff that HUD is looking for when it comes to data quality. So especially as we're all getting used to this report, it might just be a way of measuring, kind of getting a gauge of what's the baseline.
I thought it was really interesting too on the last sysadmin call that HUD had with HMIS system administrators. They explicitly said, we expect this first time around to be bumpy, and I think at this point we all know that, and it definitely seems like HUD is aware and that they're willing to work with us, work with communities. So from that perspective, it feels a little bit more collaborative than I think it might have in the past. But still, because we are expecting it to be a little bumpy too, we want to make sure that you all are aware that not only will the support staff be supporting you all, but, Eric and myself and Sam Taylor, the product team, engineers, it's going to kind of be an all hands on deck to make sure that we are supporting everyone the best we can through the release and the submission process, especially for this first year while we're all cutting our teeth on this new LSA report. So I'm sure all of us are going to have lots of questions, and we'll share information that we have with you as we get it for sure. As far as what we'd like you all to do for support requests, please make sure you use the internal support system within Client Track and include LSA 2018 in the subject line just to make sure we can identify and prioritize those better. Once we're actually at the phase where you all are, submitting LSA export files to HDX and trying to troubleshoot things, please make sure that you attach the specific export files that you're referencing or experiencing challenges with, to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing and addressing your problems accurately. And this last slide here, just want to make sure, give you all a reminder that this Thursday, September 13th, we are having a deeper dive technical training. Hopefully this will allow us to wrap our brains around any changes that HUD makes and be able to parse out relevant information to you, plus, of course, add in details that we already know. Are there any questions? We have a few minutes left here.
We did receive quite a few questions.
Oh, and one, for checking your setup data, we do have Data Explorer domains that will report out all of your setup data information related to your project. So you'll be able to see what's in for the project and any inventory information, as well as geocode and address information.
I see a question in here about the information date or the inventory. I'll just go back to this slide real quick. I think there's a misunderstanding. So this date created here is a system-created date that simply signifies when the record was actually recorded into the system. HUD wants this inventory start date to be the date that the record comes online, meaning that the date that the inventory becomes active. So if HUD were to run a report that looks at the difference between the date that you created this record and the date that the inventory actually is anticipated to be started, they should be able to classify that as under development. Your inventory start date would not be recorded in HMIS as of the day that you physically entered the record, unless the inventory was actually started that day. I know it's kind of clunky, and I expect that you'll probably have more questions about this as we go, and I probably could have done a better job explaining it, and hopefully HUD will be more clear in their trainings that they provide to you about how they specifically want to see this date. But we wanted to make sure we explicitly cover this because we've already received some questions about whether or not inventory records were important and if the information date even mattered. And the answer is the information date for LSA purposes is arguably the most important date.
So Dan, we have quite a few, Dan and Eric, we have quite a few questions that I don't believe were addressed. So maybe we can go through those if we have time.
Yeah, stick around and answer some questions for sure.
So one of the questions that we had is, how can we help you? If you know areas that you've had difficulties with programming, can we focus on looking at those locally to help identify bugs?
So in general, when it comes to testing, once it's released, we want to make sure that if there are any type of non-data related errors, when I say data related, meaning like if you're missing some piece of setup data, the HDX will flag that. So if you're getting some type of an error message when you're uploading to HDX and it's not related to data that you can add, that of course would be something we would want to know as soon as possible. And just any type of context you can give for what the error message was. So you'll have an error report if you could send that as well as the export files themselves. That would be the information that would be best for us.
And for those of you that did sign up for HDX 2.0 access a couple months ago, back when HUD opened their quote-unquote beta period, once we release the beta version, the LSA, and you want to upload, we just want to give a little caveat that we are experiencing HUD making a lot of real-time changes on the back end, and so validation is a bit of a moving target. Sometimes, we'll get a validation error 1 second that, 2 hours later doesn't show up. Validation errors that don't even matter or aren't even part of the LSA. So it definitely seems like they're still actively providing tweaks. So just want to provide that caveat. Certainly, if you're experiencing an issue, please submit them to us. But we have experienced a lot of non-valid validation challenges so far, just to be totally transparent.
Okay, one of the next questions is, can the information date before the date created if we are late to create a project? The project starts on September 1st, but the physical project won't start enrollments on the 3rd, and the HMIS admin creates the project on the 2nd. Will the LSA reject?
So the date created, again, that's just a system date that HUD could use at some point in the future, I guess, if they wanted to be able to see when the records were actually created. But those dates are not referenced for the LSA. So if you had to backdate inventory, that's fine. It should not create any issues. You would just tell the system when your create the record for when your actual inventory came online. And it sounds like in the example you gave that your inventory start date and your information date would simply be the same date. Now, your information date cannot be before your inventory start date.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question, why wouldn't your initial record have an information date of 3/1/2017 as these beds are under development? Beds under development should have an information date that matches create date.
That's not correct, actually. HUD gave a pretty detailed webinar about some of this information, but I think we actually already covered this one, answered this one accidentally a little bit earlier. But the information dates that is defined as the date that the inventory record is accurate. I'll pull up the definitions here again. Now, I guess maybe there is a distinction to be made here. It's not necessarily the effective date. It's the date that I think I see what they're talking about. This wording that HUD has here for under development seems a little nebulous. The way that APT explained it to us is that the effective date of the record does not mean the date that the record is physically created in HMIS. It means the date that inventory would come into effect. I hope that makes sense.
And then we have some more questions. The next one is there a report to verify project setup data?
That was, so there's not a canned report, but they do have Data Explorer domains to know that, to be able to export that data from the system and see what information is in there for them.
Okay, thank you. And then this one's specific. How do we enter beds that can be used for both single individual or families if a project only has 10 beds in client track?
So I believe, and this comes with a caveat that this is my perception, I believe that HUD would not consider that to be a change in inventory, and that would just be part of your same inventory record, in that how you use those particular beds, that they may change over time or based on usage. That said, it might be a good question for you to ask HUD in the AAQ, especially knowing that they intend to cross-reference the LSA information with the HIC information more robustly in the future. That might be a good question to get in front of. The way I understood it is that if you had addition of beds, removal of beds, wholesale reclassification of beds, that would need to be a new record, but there does seem to be some nuanced gray area in what HUD would consider needing to be a new record versus what could just be the same record.
Okay, and then we have, I think, probably like 5 more questions. Are we expected to go back on the dates for the inventory when it started?
So this is a little outside the purview of LSA. I think this might be more applicable for the HIC. I think that HUD would probably like it to be as accurate as possible. That said, for the LSA, it's looking at your information date. So HUD recommends, that you update your inventory, at a minimum, at least before the point in time in HIC, and then again before the fall, used to be AHAR, now LSA submission, to make sure everything's accurate. I don't know. I don't know how HUD is going to look at start dates for determining new and under development and current beds for the HIC, if they're going to do that at all. So I don't know that I can fully answer that question to your satisfaction, but I would say if there's one thing you focused on, make sure that information date is accurate. So if that was something where you've had the same inventory for the last 3 years, then you would want to make sure that information date was backdated to the correct date that information was current. You're recognizing that your start date can't be after your information date. So if you had to backdate information date and it went beyond your start date, then you would need to change that start date too.
Okay, the next question. I don't often use Data Explorer. Are those domains for checking setup data easy to access or in a particular work group?
We deploy them to the baseline work groups, HMIS work groups, and they are top level, I must use a very top level domain. There will be, if you ask any question, you should see in the baseline HMIS work groups the project setup ones right there.
Okay, the next one, how do you want us to submit support issues? And then the next question kind of goes along with that. Is there a turnaround time to get a response?
Yeah, so we had a slide here at the end with support issues. Support's asked us to let you all know that, you know, use the ticketing system. There are some reasons for using the ticketing system besides just submitting a ticket through the system. And, you know, we're able to pull information about what screen you're on and things like that. So make sure you submit a ticket through the system and use LSA 2018 in the subject lines so that we can try to triage all those together. I don't have a good answer on exactly how fast. I imagine it would depend a lot on the particular issue, how fast we could turn something around. I can say, though, without any hesitation, that we'll be living, eating, and breathing LSA for the next few months. So it's not like we're going to release this and then just disappear into the night.
Okay, and we just have two more questions. How far back are you expecting for us to go back in the housing inventory? Yeah,
as far as the LSA, the focus of a lot of it is around the active report range. With that being said, we do not, HUD has not communicated how they are expecting to use records, inventory records submitted in the LSA for anything else. So to Dan's point, when it talks about the information date, you want to make sure the information is accurate. And I think that's probably the closest guidance we can provide. We don't have any particular information on length of time and look back in regards to how much data should be in your system.
We know that HUD intends LSA and HIC to align. They've even gone so far as to publicly say that they intend to collect inventory record IDs in the HIC moving forward. So we definitely know that HUD's looking at that, but we don't know, unfortunately, just if they're also going to try to look at that longitudinally. The client data we do know is going to cascade back, but we don't know what future effects the HIC, the inventory information might have on other reports. For LSA, though, as long as it's active for the report period, you should be fine, and maybe that's the way to look at it. You get it correct for the, for the reporting year, so September or October 1st, 2017 through September 30th, 2018, and then once you get your LSA in, you have an opportunity to figure out what to do before the PIT and HIT come up based on any upcoming HUD guidance.
That's not the same thing as saying you only need to put your information date as far back as 10/1/17. So it's make sure your inventory is correct.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, and then in what cloud does the project information live?
There are multiple. So you'll have, there'll be programs and then project and addresses, there'll be inventory, and then there will be program grants if you're interested in looking at funding source links in Data Explorer.
Okay, and we just want to remind everyone, if you have specific questions, to reach out to your account manager and we can funnel those questions to where they need to go. And we'd like to thank Eric and Dan for the excellent presentation. And thank you for joining us for today's webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,